G'day folks, and welcome to this review of North Africa 41. This is a 2023 publication by GMT Games. It is a Mark Simonitch design in the style of his Bond 19XX games. Now this has quite a big footprint, and you'll notice in the background here I have Vassal set up. This is because this contains two large long map sheets, one 22 by 34 inch, one 22 by 28 inch maps, and they're aligned side to side to form this long front along North Africa, the North African coast. It has a big footprint, and for that reason I didn't have a table space available, so I've been learning this game on Vassal, which is what you see in the background here. And it's a good thing because the Vassal module is great, and it's a good game for Vassal. It's not big footprint, but for 90% of the game, your focus is on about 1 square foot of coverage of that map. So if I zoom out here, this is where my front is at the time. It's around just sort of east of Tobruk, around Sollum, Hellfire Pass, west of Sidi Barrani, west of El Alamein and Mersa Matruh. But if I zoom out, here are my combat units. There's not much else happening. Your units will start in your base, you'll ferry them out or ship them out or truck them out or drive them out to the front, and this is where the vast bulk of your activity is. Movement, combat, supply considerations, disruption, recovery, etc. You are focusing 90% of your time on this area. So whilst it has a big footprint, Vassal works really well in terms of enabling you to just focus down on the detail at the crux of the activity. And there are many distinguishing features, many features about this game that contribute to this focus. And I want to go through them. There are many defining features of North Africa 41 which distinguish it apart from other games in Mark's style of design. I'll point out as well, first up, that this is kind of, in a way, it's an evolution of some of Mark's early designs. Particularly, I want to acknowledge The Legend Begins, which he designed back in 1991, focusing on North Africa. Very similar sort of art style, map design and the like. Map art style, I'll point out. But the design has changed quite considerably since then to reflect more his 19XX style of games. But I'll first point out there are no Bonds in this title. There are instead overlapping zones of control, but no bonds that you see in other games that Mark has designed. The map is obviously a distinguishing feature. Large parcels of open desert terrain, not a lot of terrain features. The tracks and the highways are key considerations, as are the escarpments and little things. The towns, the fortifications are key. Being able to build fortifications in defensive or defendable areas is a critical consideration. But for the most part, yeah, you're manoeuvring through largely open terrain with the coast as a sort of holding position, a solid position on the coast. In this example here, you can see the Allies have got their fortification out at Sollum, anchoring their position with a long line out in the desert. Another distinguishing feature is the use of supplies, and supplies are a dominant consideration when playing this game, both sides. You'll start with some supplies in the setup, and each turn, each side, the Axis and the Commonwealth Allied forces, will get 2 new supply points. They start in your bases. The Allies have the Nile, which is in the far east. The Axis forces have Tripoli, which is over in the far west. Your supplies kind of arrive, in fact the Axis supplies arrive in Italy. They have to be shipped over to Tripoli and then trucked across the desert to the focus of the fighting here. So here you can see an Axis mobile supply unit. Their supplies have been loaded onto trucks in Tripoli and have been sent out across the desert to the focus of the fighting. Once they arrive in this vicinity, you need your supplies to fuel your combat. If you don't fuel your combat with supply, you are limited to 9 attack factors and you cannot gain tank shifts. This is important because you need those more than 9 attack factors and you need those tank shifts. So for the most part, you need your big combats, need supplies to be efficient. And you're only getting 2 supplies per turn. You can capture any supplies, but for the most part, you're relying on what you send across the desert. Why is this important? Well, because a typical turn actually has 3 impulses, and each impulse consists of some administration, but principally movement, combat, and recovery supply. So you are doing 3 combat phases, 3 impulses, a movement in a combat phase, a movement in a combat phase, a movement in a combat phase in one turn. You get supplies, and your 2 supplies have to last for that entire turn. So if you exhaust, for example, you're on the defensive, you're close to your base, you exhaust 2 supplies in counterattacks in the first impulse, you're leaving yourself open to having no supplies for a second and a third impulse before you then have to recover again. You may also have to spend supplies in the supply attrition phase, and if you can't do that, all your units are out of supply. So, supply management is paramount. It's a paramount consideration. You need to be careful when, where, how you use your supplies. You can do many things with supplies beyond just, well, you can't do many things. You can also use your supplies to refuel your headquarters, your core. And having them as sort of another mobile supply source, a source of artillery support, is also a consideration. Management of your supplies, where they go, when they fuel your attacks, what attacks you're fueling, what kind of supply reserve you're maintaining behind the lines. Are you protecting those supplies? These are some key considerations, and it really drives the momentum. An offensive can stall and become very vulnerable to counterattack if it runs out of supplies. Now, this is public information, of course, so when the Axis forces are attacking, if they find themselves without supplies, the Commonwealth player will know this. They'll know their vulnerability to a counterattack because they can't subsequently counterattack the Allied forces. So, yes, you need to be very careful with your supplies. As I mentioned, there's no ZOC bonds. There are overlapping ZOCs, which creates some very interesting situations. You don't have that ZOC front line. Armor shifts are important as well. Early in the game, you don't have, or the Germans, the Axis forces have a lot of powerful armor. Later in the game, the Allied forces begin to build up their heavy tanks, and they reach a parity, and then they kind of almost overtake the Axis forces. The further you advance, the further you are from your base and the sources of your supply. As the Axis advance towards El Alamein, it's a long journey for their supplies. The Axis have to ship their supplies over in convoys from Italy, and they have to make an anti-shipping roll on this anti-shipping table to see if their convoys are intercepted, and there's a risk that they will lose their supplies and combat units and reinforcements and everything that they're shipping over from North Africa. Now, because supply limits everything, and you only get 2 supplies per turn, you are, on average, pretty much, only engaging in 2 large combat actions per turn. That's 2 combats over 3 impulses. This is very different to the likes of Ardennes 44, of Holland 44, of Stalingrad 42, where there's often combat taking place all over the map. 2 supply points per turn over 3 impulses, 2 combats over 3 impulses. And that's if you spend both, if you don't keep a reserve in store. So there is a lot of careful tactical maneuvering going on, a lot of sort of preparing an offensive, stockpiling your supplies, getting them ready, protecting them and the like. The advanced after combat rules are quite generous, so there is a lot of attack, breakthrough, counterattack in this game. And your offensive operations really need to plan for the enemy opportunities to respond and counterattack. You need to look at their supplies. How many supplies do they have? Capturing any supplies is a great coup if you can manage that. All of these factors, all these elements, supply and the 3 impulses in a turn, and the journey of these supplies across the desert really create quite a unique feel that does stand this experience apart from other titles that Mark Simonitch has designed. Replacements are also managed quite differently. They are actually replacement counters. So here you can see British heavy tank replacements. Over here are Italian infantry replacements. These are actually counters that you move from your base. So these heavy tanks have come from the Nile over in the east. They've travelled across the desert, and when they get close to a unit, they can be spent to add those replacements to the unit. So the Italians here, if they have any reduced infantry units in this vicinity, they remove this replacement counter and add the replacement to the actual unit. The replacements aren't instantly teleported onto the map. Likewise, reinforcements, they start off in your base and they have to travel across the desert. Another element of this game is the use of resource points. Now, we've seen resource points in some of other Mark Simonitch designs, but in this game, there's a lot more you can do. And I want to bring up this player aid chart to show you the things you can spend your resource points on. These vary from port repairs to air units to replacing trucks to long-range desert groups and, well, a full list there. So it creates some really interesting options for you in how you spend your resource points. How do you get these resource points? Well, at the start of each impulse, you'll make a roll on the event table. And the most common result is adding a resource point. You'll see this a lot. But sometimes you'll get free air support units or the long-range desert group or bombing raids on ports and the like. It creates an interesting little, almost a mini management game within the game where you are managing your resource points. You need to spend your resource points to build fortifications, of course. So early in the game, the Allies are spending a lot of the bulk of their resource points, I'd say, on building fortifications around Tobruk and Bardia and around Hellfire Pass, Sidi Barrani and the like, trying to build up their defences to slow down this Axis juggernaut as it advances east across the desert. As the ports become damaged, so here you can see the port status for Tobruk, it's been damaged. You can spend your resources to repair that, or the Allies can spend this is a port of Tobruk in Axis hands, they can spend their resource points to launch a bombing raid to damage the port on the port demolition and bombing table. So there's all these like little mini games, mini kind of considerations, management factors. You're managing your supplies, paramount, but you're also managing your resources and your replacements, and of course the journey of your reinforcements. There are delay markers which do play a typically minor but sometimes important role in the game. Many will know this from Ardennes 44, where you place these delay markers and it adds to the movement cost. Placing these at a critical moment can slow down the arrival of reinforcements or the movement of enemy troops between areas. There are quite generous extended movement and road movement rules for infantry and tanks, so your units can move quite rapidly, particularly if using these major highways. Here's a terrain effects chart. A highway only costs mechanized units a quarter of their movement points. Now when they've typically got 5-6 movement points, they're moving 5 times 4, 20 hexes across these highways, and they can almost reach the front. So from the Nile Delta, which is over in the east here, there are these little highway points. You can see here a 4, a 5, there's a 6 here, a 7 and an 8. So many allied mechanized units can reach all the way out to nearly Sidi Barrani from the Nile Delta using that mechanized movement rate along the highway, subject to these delay markers. What does all this mean? Bringing this all together, bringing these elements, the defining, distinguishing features of North Africa 41, it is very different. It is much more focused than I think any other game in Mark's series. Again, you have pretty much 1 square foot off, and this is probably the biggest the front has ever been. Very often, well, until very recently, the front was only 4, 5 hexes. It's probably only about this big, so you're often focused on very narrow passes. The Axis offensive, if I can go over to Elegalia, the Axis commenced their offense with an attack, I think it's on Mersa Brega here, 1 particular hex. They drive through this single hex and then up to Agadabia and then up to Benghazi. They cross the escarpment at Benina al Abier and then on to Derna and Tobruk. But there's only kind of 1 highway through here. There's some coastal tracks that they're often sort of working through, but for the most part, you are focused on just 2 to 3 hexes at a time. You may have some units moving along these desert tracks. You may have opted to send a main force through there, which may give us a sort of second little area of focus. But yeah, in short, most of your game is focused on a very small sector. This means that there is not as much, relatively speaking, relative to other games in the series, there is not as much activity. It is often quieter, turns are often quieter than in your typical Mark Simonitch design. Often you'll have no supplies. Both sides will have no supplies available, or they'll be keeping 1 MSU in reserve for an emergency, and so there's no combat taking place. And that's kind of what happened towards the end here, is both sides sort of counterattack, attack, counterattack, counterattack. They kind of ran out of supplies. The Germans have got 1 MSU up here, for example, and that's it. They're keeping this in reserve. they're not in a position to attack, because if they spend that MSU to attack, the British have 2 MSUs back here. They can counterattack, and there's nothing that the Germans can do. So yeah, a lot of the impulses, a lot of the turns are quieter, far quieter than you've seen in any other Mark Simonitch games. It is a game of managing supplies, of careful tactical manoeuvring, of planning your forces, and finding the right moment to strike. And it can be difficult to appreciate the importance of your supplies in all those considerations. So yes, just to reiterate, supplies are the foundation for all your planning in North Africa 41. What is else is there to say? Look, supplies, out of supply is critical. If you run out of supply, they're quite generous supply rules, but it's quite easy to find yourself cut off and out of supply, and then your units are crippled. Your highly mobile, in supply, mechanized formations, which as I said, can move up to 20 hexes along this coastal road, can suddenly find themselves reduced to tactical movement, 2 hex movement in the desert away from their front lines. So this is certainly a game where you are looking to cut off enemy forces from their supplies, isolate them, in effect sever their Achilles heel and stop them maneuvering through the desert. This is a fascinating game of sort of looking for these opportunities to maneuver, to use your stockpile of supplies and prevent your opponent from doing the same. It plays very well solo. It is quite long because, again, it's only a 19-turn game, but every turn consists of 3 impulses. So in effect, you've got 3 times 19. You've got 57 movement turns, 57 combat phases in the game. A lot of the time that'll be quiet, but that's what you're working through. There are unit withdrawals. There are really interesting and initially confusing system of tank upgrades. So the British have their medium tanks, light tanks upgraded to these heavy tanks over the course of the game, and that really boosts their strength. Look, a lot of these kind of like administration that really changes the dynamics of the game. Came out in 2023. I will point out as well, there is a North Africa 40 Ziploc sort of bagged expansion to this game that is currently on GMT's P500 site for $29 US. And it adds sort of it's almost a prequel to this. An expansion, you need the base game to play it, but it will add some, I believe, additional rules and additional elements. Let me bring over, here we go. This is the counter sheet and some additional elements for North Africa 40, a new rules book, counter sheet, turn record track, player aid, and scenario setup and reinforcement cards. So you'll need North Africa 41 to be able to play that, but it will enhance the experience as well. All right, folks, thank you for watching. I hope this has been informative. Take care. Thanks all.